thank you. I think you'll all agree that that was fascinating. You covered so much ground in such a short space of time. I'm going to ask the first question and then I'll throw the floor open to all of you. You know, you touched in passing, of course, about a subject that both you and I are equally interested in, which is the P5. I mean, if there's, I think, one country that is the most obvious next candidate is India. I mean, just because, you know, in India's standing in the world, in purchasing power parity terms now, the number one economy in the world is China, number two, United States, number three is India. So clearly you've made it, in a sense, into that league. But if you had, you know, since you know the UN well, and you know India well, is there a secret passage you can think of that can get India into the UN Security Council?
No, and I think that if there were a secret passage, the compatriots of my friend, the Pakistani High Commissioner, would ensure that it was blocked.
So we live in an interdependent world. So the first country you have to convince is Pakistan, obviously.
That's right. Well, you know, part of the challenge is that really the bar to amend the charter, the UN charter, has been set very high.
Yeah.
You need 2/3 of the General Assembly, which is now 128 countries, to vote in favor of whatever formula is agreed. And it'll have to be a formula because India will not benefit alone. If there is going to be reform of the Security Council, it'll have to take into account the legitimate claims of a whole number of other actors and, of course, the diagnosis that the Council is deeply lopsided because it really does reflect the geopolitical realities of 1945, not just the P5, the permanent 5 members, but even the fact that Europe, with 5% of the world's population, has 33% of the Security Council seats. Why should it? I mean, there's
40%.
Well, 40 if you count Russia as a European power.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the fact is that, I mean, it is, of course, both a European and a Eurasian power. So the fact is that you're looking at a totally anomalous situation, and therefore the formula will have to satisfy all these contenders. But at the same time, this formula, after being passed by 2/3 of the members of the General Assembly, then has to be ratified by 2/3 of the member states, including all 5 permanent members, the very countries whose powers you're trying to dilute. Now, that's what the Charter requires. So it has to be a formula that's simultaneously acceptable to 2/3 of the countries and not unacceptable to these 5. And they don't even need to oppose it officially because ratification in most countries is a parliamentary procedure. So you suddenly find a US senator just pockets the bill to ratify it. It never comes to a vote. Or the Chinese say, you know, we have this very important parliament, the Chinese People's Consultative Committee, and there are important interests there that won't allow this to be voted yet. And then ratification never happens, even if you get it through the General Assembly. So the great challenge with amending the Charter is what lies behind the difficulty in reforming the UN Security Council. Way back in 1992, the then newly elected Secretary General Boutros Ghali said UN Security Council must be accomplished in time, reform must be accomplished in time for the 50th anniversary of the organization in 1995. Well, the 50th has gone by, the 60th has gone by, the 70th went by last year. And I really wonder how long this will take. And what worries me, Kishore, just to finish the thought, is that if it doesn't go on, whether the relevance of the United Nations is going to look increasingly sort of threadbare in a world in which other powers have acquired a status and an influence that is no longer. Imagine if sanctions were declared on some South Asian country, a neighbor of ours, without India being consulted, or in Southern Africa without South Africa being consulted, or sanctions were declared. That's just really one kind of example. Many other actions the Council can take. Ultimately, a point will come when a powerful enough country will say, sorry, Council, we're not going to listen to you. We will not honor these sanctions. And then what happens? If the legitimacy of the Council is undermined, international law and the entire underpinnings of the international structure get compromised. So I think it's very important for those of us who are multilateralists like Kishore and me to plead for reform in the interests of the organization itself and not just those of any countries that may benefit.
Okay, questions? I see some gentlemen. Please come to the microphone. If you don't mind, just come up to the microphone. Those who want to ask questions.
And tell me sort of who you are. Are you a student? Are you a teacher? Are you somebody else?
Yeah, hi Dr. Tharoor. I'm Sumant and I'm a business management student at a private university here in Singapore.
Right.
I've followed a few of your speeches, and since you're a seasoned diplomat, India has around 160, 165 missions around the world, but the number of diplomats is somewhere less than 900. And Brazil has over 4,000, UK has over 6,000.
Brazil has 1,200, China
Yes.
has
And
4,000,
US has
yeah.
20,000. In fact,
Correct.
as you mentioned in one of your speeches, US has more talented diplomats in its embassy in New Delhi than India has all over the world.
Correct.
So when you believe that India is understaffed in its foreign civil servants, you believe that should only people who clear Indian Foreign Services exam should be posted there, because most of the businesses, most of the relations between two countries are based on business and trade. So how about posting some business management professionals for
I
doing
agree,
that?
I agree. Well, look, this is a cause I have.
Shall we take 2-3 questions since there's a lot of them? You can take a note. Yeah. So the first question on the size of the Indian Foreign Service, please. Question here.
Hi, I'm Prem, MPP student at the school, and I'm from Nepal. In relation to such a big topic, and what role do you think should India play to maintain peace and tranquility in SAARC region, particularly taking in consideration to its worsening relationship with small neighbors? My second question is, what fears India to bring China into SAARC as active member? Thank you.
Okay, can we take the question at the third mic there? Yes. Please go ahead. Yeah.
Hello, yes, my name is Anish Mishra. I'm doing a degree here in Singapore. My question is, I would like to get comments from you on the wisdom of Modi's utterance of Balochistan from the Red Fort. I believe Congress Party has said that they actually stand with the government of this. So, I mean, I'll get your views on this, and how do you think this is actually a game changer for India on the larger Kashmir issue? Thanks.
Okay, 3 questions. Go ahead.
Okay, I'll take them in the order in which they were asked. So first, on the Foreign Service, let me stress that this is certainly my view. I have actually written this in the book, Pax Indica. I've developed on the theme subsequently as chairman of the Standing Committee of Parliament on Foreign Affairs. And very recently, we have issued a very strong report, of which I am, of course, the author, so by all means go into it. It made some waves in the Indian media when it came out, making a number of recommendations that the ministry is obliged to respond to. It's not necessarily obliged to adopt. But the following, this is after extensive hearings with the Foreign Ministry personnel and with other ministries. The first is, indeed, we need to increase the size significantly. The authorized number of diplomatic positions in India is 922, but they only have 740 people on board. Secondly, their chosen method of expansion, which is by hiring more youngsters every year, doesn't solve the problem, because they need certain gaps to be filled right now, and the people whom they're hiring now will only be trained and effective 10 years from now, so they're not doing anything about today's needs. Third, there's a serious issue of quality. We are no longer getting the best and the brightest of the central UPSC examinations opting for the Foreign Service. In fact, it's now no longer a favored choice, a dramatic transformation from the days in which you really had to be in the top 10 to actually get into the Foreign Service. Today, they're really quite dredging the bottom, I shouldn't say bottom of the barrel, because tens of thousands of people take the exam and only a few hundred pass. But from those who pass, they're going fairly low down the pile to get their officers. And I don't think the best diplomats are people who really wanted to be cops or customs officers or whatever. Then there's a question of the one-size-fits-all examination. Doesn't really look for the kinds of qualities that you need in a diplomat. And so we have urged that there should be either an additional paper for those who opt for the Foreign Service, or there should be extra weightage given in the interview to such qualities as curiosity about the world, a talent or aptitude for languages, a capacity to explain things to foreigners, the ability to articulate ideas effectively. These are extremely important skills in diplomacy that you cannot assess by a written paper, and which very often, in fact, are lacking in some of the people now being recruited. And then we also go into the question of training subsequent upon recruitment. I have gone so far as to suggest that we open the examinations to NRIs, non-resident Indian students, who are Indian citizens, of course, but who have not studied in the Indian system, have studied in places like Singapore or Kuwait or Dubai or Paris or London, and who have all these qualities, often have grown up learning foreign languages in the countries where they are, but who say Hindi isn't good enough to take the Foreign Service exam, that to let them do it. And the ministry has accepted the suggestion that maybe those who have studied at least 50% of their schooling abroad should be allowed to waive the Indian language requirement and still join the service. So these are all ideas. And then, of course, we have gone in for the notion of lateral entry, which you mentioned, that we should get in people from other professions, academia, the private sector, including management types, but also, journalists for our public diplomacy work, or people who are not career civil servants, bring them in on a contract basis, even in mid to senior positions, so that we actually gain from the experience they've acquired in the real world. Now, all these suggestions out there, they're on the table. I've advocated them passionately in the media as well as in the Parliament. If we have an opportunity to debate this in Parliament, you can be sure that I'll make a very strong pitch for this.
Shashi,
Whether it'll get
you
implemented...
may have to make your answer shorter because there are lots of questions.
A lot of questions, all right. But you get
By the way,
the
you can read his report.
read my report. It's actually on the web. It's on the web. Go to the Lok Sabha and look for the report of the Standing Committee. Yeah, we have these sittings of the Standing Committee, which I always find quite peculiar, but we do it. On the question of neighbors, obviously extremely important. I've been one of those who's advocated for some time that India can afford to have the attitude that we should have asymmetrical relations with our neighbors. That is, we should give more than we expect to get. You sit around a table in the SAARC, and India accounts for 70% of the total population of South Asia and 80% of the total GDP. So inevitably, whether we like it or not, we displace more weight. We get in people's faces. Our elbows poke into their midriffs. We really need to worry about this. I mean, it's a problem common to every big country in its neighborhood. I've forgotten which country it was that had the famous line, cursing God for being so far from God and so close to the United States.
Mexico.
Mexico. The same sort of notion. We are perhaps evoking similar feelings on the part of many of our neighbors. So we do need to give great importance. Certainly, during my brief stint in the Foreign Ministry, that was one of my recurrent themes. I know that the government of India is in principle committed to this. I also know that in practice things always don't always work out the way we'd like them to, and that some of the relationships are not terribly good at the moment. Mind you, not every bad relationship is India the only one to blame. I'll leave it there. I think there are sometimes responsibilities on both sides, but I certainly agree that India should do more and should give more. Finally, on the question of the Balochistan reference.
No, before that, he was suggesting one way to make sure to solve the problem of the elephant in the room is to bring in the other elephant, China, into SAARC.
Oh, he did suggest that. He did suggest that. You're quite right. At the moment, I'm a bit agnostic on this question. I think the South Asian Association, by definition, is for South Asian countries. And unless Tibet becomes independent, I don't see a South Asian possibility emerging out of a place like Beijing. So I think we have to accept that China is not a South Asian power. It can certainly be an East Asian power. It is a Central Asian power to some degree, but a South Asian power, I think, is debatable. But an observer status, I'm 100% in favor of. Just as I think India will have observer status now, or does have it now in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. I think the same logic should be applied to SAARC, and they should be invited to be observers.
Balochistan.
Balochistan. Now, on that one, the position taken by my party was that it is not customary for us to refer to the internal disputes of other states, simply because we have always taken the position that we don't interfere in other countries' internal affairs, and that the fact that Pakistan refers to our internal affairs in its speeches is something that is condemnable, not worth imitating. That's, broadly speaking, why some Congress Party spokesmen have criticized this. I would go a little beyond that. I think that point is fair. I think it's one of these issues where there are good arguments on both sides. I think that point is a very fair one. Another point that's worth making is that there have been for some years now unsubstantiated, and many of us believe unfounded, allegations from the Pakistani side that India has been meddling in Balochistan through its intelligence agencies and so on. To my knowledge, that is simply not true. It's also not very feasible given that India doesn't share a border with Balochistan. So by seeming to elevate the issue to a prime ministerial speech, it may unnecessarily give fodder to the conspiracy theorists who have already been attacking India for something that it believes it hasn't done. So why are we weakening our own defense in this area? That's a second objection. But on the flip side of it is the feeling that India has taken so much of needling from Pakistan on every issue, from Kashmir to the situation of Indian minorities and Muslims in particular in India and so on, that it's time to push some needles in the opposite direction also. And now you may say that this, what we in India call tu meh, should not be worthy of a prime ministerial discourse. That's another debate. But you can understand the reason why perhaps as many Indians applauded this reference as objected to it on the grounds I've described.
Okay, we have, like the Egyptian mummy, we are strapped for time. So we have 5
Let's run
minutes.
slightly over. We started 5 minutes late. Yeah.
So I'll tell you what, why don't we just take, if you don't mind, I see I count there's 7 of you, 7 of you remains there. Just pose very short, sharp questions. And then
I'll give you long-winded answers.
And he will give a very the fastest long-winded answer in history in 3 minutes. So can you start with you and then we quickly go around? Yeah, we'll take notes.
Yeah, Abhishek Vaidyanathan. I'm an exchange student from Canada at the law school here. My question is with regards to the effect on labor that automation might have and how that might affect the 21st century and India's global relations within that. One prediction with the significant loss of labor would be that potential solutions that have been posed include minimum wage standards, also a potential rise in protectionism as well. So how might India cope with that, and what is your view on that potential effect of automation on India's economy as well?
Okay, good. The gentleman behind you, please. Question 2. Yeah.
Thank you very much for this really amazing talk, Dr. Tharoor. My name is Paricha Chatterjee, and my question is that a lot of people seem to, it's a bit more generic, a lot of people seem to talk about India in the context of a superpower, or at least one of many in future. But do you really think that that might be good for India, given the fact that at least in recent history, most of the big powers, or the superpowers, have been countries which are relatively more centralized, like maybe Russia or the US, or maybe China, an emerging China. But a country like India, which is so diverse, might spend a lot of time bickering amongst ourselves to kind of say that, okay, this is what we need to do in order to rise up and play a dominant role, or one of many in the world. So that's my question, whether we should aspire towards that. And a very quick follow-up question is that we also...
Maybe not a follow-up question.
Okay. I'll try my best with respect to the problems that we have with our neighbors, the disputes that we have. Do you think that it is more of a nuisance for India, or do you think it is something that we will need to confront in order to realize the potential over time? Thank you.
Okay, the lady, please. Yes.
My name is Neha Simlai. I'm from India, and I'm an MPA student this year at the LKY school. I wanted to check with you, what do you think the future of the party you represent is in Pax Indica, and also who amongst the current leadership in your party is going to steer India into Pax Indica?
The name is Shashi Tharoor. Sorry. Okay.
Good evening, Dr. Tharoor. Thanks for the speech. That was fantastic. My name is Sagar Desai, and I work in asset management here. A quick question around your the very first point that you make. It's around how India was a victim to bureaucracy, which was at the top of the commanding chain in India for the first 40, 50 years. However, when I look at the Singapore model, actually I find that the bureaucracy was right at the top, and still it succeeded way beyond its expected potential. So I feel it was the failure of the bureaucracy in those 40 years that led to India's demise in those 40 years than it being the reason why it couldn't succeed.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, please, up there, yes.
A very good evening, Dr. Tharoor. I am Ketan, and I'm doing my Master's in International Relations from RSIS NTU. And I have 2 small questions related to the
Quick
Islamic
ones,
world.
quick
Quick ones,
ones.
yeah, really quick. I'll be quick. First is, on the question of India's role in the new Middle East, especially on the question related to the recognition of the Syrian opposition. And the second one is related to Kashmir. Why is our Kashmir policy failing despite engaging with the non-state actors? So these are two.
Okay, thank you. The gentleman behind you, then we'll come to the...
Okay, I'll just stick to the question. The question is whether you would agree with the 7-7 reform policy that Professor Kishore has proposed for the United Nations Security Council with seven permanent members, 7 semi-permanent members, and 7 elected members. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Good evening, Dr. Tharoor. Thank you for your enthralling lecture, first of all. I have a very short question. We have talked a lot about the social cohesion, political cohesion, and interdependence between Asian economies, especially in the prevailing anti-globalization sentiment that is there. How far do you think India's foreign relations with Pakistan, especially the belligerent stance adopted by Pakistan towards India and its foreign relations, would define India's role in the world of 21st century as a champion of globalization?
Thank you. Well, you covered all. So now you're going to get us the fastest long-winded answer.
We began 5 minutes late.
5
So
minutes.
give me 5 minutes, we'll finish 5 minutes
Sure.
late. Okay, Abhishek on
Automation. Labor.
automation's effect on labor and the risk of protectionism and wage standards. Very, very important question, it seems to me. And the truth is that at one point, the developments in modern technology were actually benefiting India. For example, the fact that American hospitals that couldn't afford to pay the technicians who were reading their MRIs could zing these MRIs across to India, have them read by equally qualified technicians in India, and get the diagnosis and the readings back overnight. That was extraordinary. I mean, pretty much every MRI from every major hospital in America is actually being read in India. So that was actually technology working to benefit Indians, just as, for example, a lot of jobs that used to be done by paralegals in the US in preparing briefs and legal documentation are now being written by fully qualified lawyers in India for less money than you'd have to pay a paralegal in America. And again, it's done using modern technology. But what happens when these paralegals are replaced by robots that can process the text and do the work? What happens when the MRIs can be read by newly sophisticated computer software? These are questions that we don't yet have answers to, but all sorts of professions are said to be under threat. One of the interesting things is, for example, the invention of the driverless car. In Singapore, a friend of mine proudly showed me his new car and said, "This is the last car I'm ever going to buy, because I replace my cars every 7 years, and within 7 years, nobody in Singapore will need a car like this. We'll all be driving driverless cars." And I said, wow, and he probably is right in Singapore. I think it may take longer in India, but we have at least 25 million people whose full-time job is being a driver. That is, unlike in the Western world, many of us are driven from place to place by full-time drivers. And what happens to them? We suddenly have a whole bunch of people who are not qualified to do anything else but drive a vehicle. So there are enormous risks. I think there will be some resistance to the encroachments of some of this technology, for one thing. For example, I would not invest in a driverless car company in India because I'm not sure it's going to make much headway. Because of other things apart, there will be a lot of resistance for this reason. But the question of protectionism, which he mentions, the question of threats to wage standards, cutting people's wages so they can compete against the robots, that may begin to happen. India has an enormous demographic advantage over countries like China. China is now investing heavily in robots because their population is aging. India has people, a young, dynamic workforce available for the next 50 years. So what are we going to do? Are we going to allow automation to destroy the prospects of these young people? I don't think so. So the answers are not fully known, but the trends and the concerns are very clear. Pariche on can we aspire to be a superpower? In all fairness, that was what my entire speech was about. It was about, I started off by saying we can't be a superpower when we're still super poor, and I tried in the course of my talk to explain that rather than a world of superpowers, I think we should move beyond the notion of superpowers to one of networked cooperation, and that was the kind of world in which India is capable of playing a central role. That was the entire speech of Pax Indica. Neha asked about the future of the Congress Party. I think it's very bright. We have a... I would say that.
You can't say anything else, right?
I was afraid you'd say that. But the truth is that all democracies are cyclical. People go up and down. At the moment, Mr. Modi is personally riding high in the polls. His party is actually plunging in the polls at the same time. And we are a parliamentary system. I think people are looking for alternatives to those who would flog Dalits for skinning a cow, for example. There's not much sympathy for that kind of behavior, which is associated with the ruling party. So I have a reasonable amount of hope that in the longer term, certainly, you will see a major revival of the Congress Party. As to who will lead it, it's very clear that the inevitable transition will be to Rahul Gandhi, the current vice president of the party. Thereafter, as happens in all politics, every leadership is tested by the electorate and before the electorate. And we will have to demonstrate our capacity to go out and get the votes and to convince people that we represent the best possible vehicle for their hopes and aspirations. I believe we do. On
bureaucracy.
Failure of bureaucracy in the first 40 years. I think that's only partly true because, in fact, in that very, very protectionist world, we really did get the best of the best and the brightest into the bureaucracy. The cream of the crop didn't have that many other options. I mean, we had an increasingly closed and closing economy. If you went into the private sector, basically we're selling soap and detergents. There wasn't a whole lot of exciting stuff happening in the private sector in India. The private sector wasn't where the action was. The public sector was making even economic policy, so you could actually manage gigantic steel companies and gigantic public sector corporations by being a bureaucrat rather than being a businessman. Why would you want to be a businessman? So the best and the brightest of our universities took the examinations, went into the bureaucracy in those first 40 years. I agree that the system and the experiment failed, but I'm not sure you can blame the quality of the people who went into it as much as in the original conception. And even there you can't blame them because they were actually learning from the lessons of their own history. India was not the only country that made the mistake. In fact, Singapore should be complimented for being one of the very few countries that chose an alternative path. Most countries did not choose Singapore's path. And some even said grudgingly that Singapore had no choice because they were cut off from a hinterland and therefore they had to be global. Whereas a country like India with potentially a vast domestic market could have afforded to have import substitution, protectionism, and so on as its mantra. But of course, the inefficiencies of the public sector that India presided over, sadly, became more and more apparent, and we were slow to learn the lessons that China, for example, embarked upon 13 years before we did, their liberalization of the economy. We just were too slow to learn, and there you can blame the politicians and the bureaucrats in equal measure. Chetan, on the new Middle East, India's role, Syrian opposition. India, I'm sorry to say, and I really am sorry to say this, does not have a role of any significance in the Middle East. And it's ironic because way back in the 50s, we were the preferred interlocutor for pretty much any major crisis, whether it was the Laos crisis, the incipient Vietnam crisis, the Suez crisis. India was a leading voice, a quick voice. We intervened, we came in, we were the first country to send troops when the UN peacekeeping force was set up after Suez, etc., etc., etc. But gradually over a period of time, India has become largely irrelevant to Middle East peacemaking, war fighting, conciliation, the works. I can't usefully point to any major role we're playing. We even used to have a special envoy for the Middle East. The post has not been filled for many years, and it doesn't surprise me because he really didn't have very much useful to do. On Syria, India has publicly expressed some sympathy for the existing government. It has not supported it directly the way in which, say, Russia is doing. It has actually spoken up in favor of a managed democratic transition via a sort of broad-based accommodative government to a different system. So it's not said that it wants this regime to continue indefinitely. But there is a great deal of sympathy for India in Syria, and India is loath to jettison its old friendships. I mean, Syria, Iraq have been amongst the countries that were sympathetic to India, even when, for example, there was a certain amount of organized hostility within the Organization of the Islamic Countries, for example, towards India on the Kashmir issue, those countries did not join the anti-Indian bandwagon, and there has to be some reciprocity in turn from the beneficiary of their sympathies. So I would say that India has been, therefore, perhaps not generally a major player in the Middle East, and on Syria in particular, it has sort of said there should be a negotiated solution. No one is trying a negotiated solution, so the suggestion is not terribly relevant in the present situation. There was a question about Kashmir policy. It would really take too long. I would encroach horribly on Kishore's time, so I'm going to pass on that, especially since it was the second question from the same questioner. Just to say that I would agree in one sentence that we can do a better job both in dealing with Kashmir domestically and in projecting our point of view internationally. A much better job. On the 777 formula, I need to discuss it further with Kishore, which is not a cop-out. I clearly understand that formulae will have to be found beyond the existing attempt of merely expanding the permanent membership and the non-permanent membership. But the problem is, if the original attempt is so difficult, wouldn't a complete reinvention be even more difficult? That is the question. Not to mention, of course, the dangers of creating a new caste system at the international level, with these sort of 3 castes that you can aspire to, of permanent, semi-permanent, and non-permanent. But I'll tell you what, I'll have a conversation with Kishore about this, and at one point I might come back to the Lee Kuan Yew School and we can talk about UN reform. And I've now forgotten the last question because I...
Social cohesion.
Social cohesion in the context, I think the word belligerence was used. Oh, it doesn't really. I think everyone sees Pakistan's problem as a purely bilateral problem, which has in many ways more to do with the challenges Pakistan's system poses. I mean, it's not an open secret. I've said it before publicly, and if the High Commissioner wishes to object, I'll take the objection in advance. But I've often pointed out the differences that in India, the state has an army. In Pakistan, the army has a state. And in no country in the world does the army command a larger proportion of that country's GDP and that country's government budget than the army of Pakistan does. And as a result, many of its policies to its neighbors on either side, to India and to Afghanistan, are shaped by the interests of the military rather than by the interests of the Pakistani people. That's my view, and that's the view of many in India. And I think many observers abroad, judging by the books that have been written by Americans and British journalists and so on in recent years, I would suggest that no one sees that as in any way undermining India's ability to advocate the policies of diversity, of increasing global democracy, of increasing global networks that I summarized and described in my remarks, which I hope transcend the purely bilateral problems we unfortunately have with our dear and valued neighbor.
I think you've all heard me say before that we are entering a new era of world history. We are seeing the return of Asia, and clearly there's absolutely no doubt, as I said at the beginning of my remarks, that India's role is going to grow by leaps and bounds in the coming decades. But the changes that India's re-emergence will bring will be incredibly complex and will be multifaceted. So we are very fortunate that today, in the space of 1 hour, 15 minutes, Shashi has given us a glimpse of this very complex new world that is going to come our way, and we should all come together now and thank him for his wonderful address.
Thank you very much. You've been a great audience.